California is the state with the largest death row population in the country, with 737 inmates awaiting execution. Paradoxically, it is also the state where the death penalty was suspended in March 2019, when Governor Gavin Newsom signed an executive order placing an indefinite moratorium on executions. Although death sentences remain legally in place, no inmate can be executed while the moratorium is in effect. In this video, we'll review the cases of the only criminals who were executed in California before the death penalty was officially suspended. On July 5, 1978, in San Diego, California, one of the coldest and most ruthless criminal sprees in the state's history began. At 10:30 a.m., 25-year-old Robert Alton Harris and his brother, Daniel Marcus Harris, left their home and headed to a fast food restaurant. There, they spotted two 16-year-old teenagers, John Mayeski and Michael Baker. The boys had gone there for breakfast, unaware they were about to become victims. Armed with a 9mm Luger pistol, Robert Harris forced them into their own car. Under threat, he drove them to a remote area, while Daniel followed in a separate vehicle, a 1963 Ford. At 11:45 a.m., with his brother watching, Robert Harris coldly and deliberately shot and killed the two teenagers. There was no negotiation, no chance to escape. The brutality was immediate and final. The Harris brothers then returned home, each driving one of the stolen vehicles. Shortly after, wearing colorful ski masks, they robbed a local bank using the victim's car. They stole $2,000 in cash and fled the scene at 12:30 p.m. Their escape didn't last long. At 1:05 p.m., San Diego police officers, led by a witness who had followed the stolen car to the suspect's residence, arrived at the scene. Robert Harris was found in possession of 20 unused 9mm rounds. Inside the house, police discovered clothing and other items used in the robbery burning in the fireplace. Hours later, at 6:20 p.m., Daniel Harris confessed. When questioned, Robert Harris admitted to participating in the bank robbery, but denied any involvement in the murders. He tried to blame his brother and downplay his own role. On March 6, 1979, Robert Alton Harris was found guilty. His sentence, death. Meanwhile, his brother Daniel was convicted only of kidnapping and sentenced to 6 years. He was released in 1983. After a series of appeals, the sentence was upheld. The execution was scheduled for April 21, 1992, marking the first execution in California in over 25 years. Before his death, Robert Harris requested 2 large pizzas, a bucket of fried chicken, and ice cream as his last meal. He was escorted to the gas chamber at San Quentin State Prison at 6:01 a.m. The execution began at 6:07, and he was pronounced dead at 6:21. His body was removed at 7 a.m. and left the prison grounds at 8:15 a.m. His execution had been delayed multiple times by federal judges, who issued 4 stays throughout the night. Eventually, the U.S. Supreme Court overturned the final stay and ordered that no federal court could intervene again without its direct authorization. Before dying, Robert Harris left behind a final statement that would be forever recorded in the prison's archives. "You can be a king or a street sweeper, but everybody dances with the Grim Reaper." David Edwin Mason. Between March and December of 1980, Mason murdered 4 elderly individuals in Alameda County. All were victims of brutal beatings, strangulation, and robbery. The first was a 73-year-old woman who had known Mason for years. She had hired him for odd jobs and had even shown him her home alarm system. On March 6, 1980, Mason used that trust to gain access to her apartment. When she attempted to activate the panic alarm, he attacked her, tied her up, beat her, and strangled her to death. On August 18th, he killed a 75-year-old man, possibly someone he had known previously. On November 11th, he attacked a 72-year-old woman. He beat her in the head with a wrench and strangled her. The autopsy revealed bruising and laceration to her vaginal tissue. On December 6, 1980, Mason murdered his fourth victim, a 75-year-old woman whose body showed signs of severe trauma, bruises, lacerations, and partially torn clothing. While awaiting trial in the Alameda County Jail, Mason murdered his cellmate on May 9, 1982. With the help of another inmate, he beat and strangled the man with a knotted towel, then hung the body from a shower bar to make it appear as. Mason was also wanted in Butte County for another murder. He had shot and killed his lover while the victim was sleeping. On January 27, 1984, David Edwin Mason was sentenced to death. But in 1993, he took a final step. He asked the court to replace his lawyer and voluntarily drop all remaining appeals. He wanted to die. The court ordered a psychiatric evaluation. After reviewing the conclusions from court-appointed psychiatrists, the judge ruled that Mason was mentally competent to make that decision. In June of 1993, the case returned to the Alameda County Superior Court, which scheduled his execution for August 24, 1993. On his final day, Mason spent time speaking with relatives over the phone. He refused a last meal and asked only for iced water. At 12:05 a.m., Mason was escorted into the gas chamber at San Quentin State Prison. 3 minutes later, Warden Daniel Vasquez asked him directly if he had changed his mind. Mason responded calmly, "No, Warden, I want to proceed. Thank you, Warden." At 12:09, the lethal gas was released. David Mason was declared dead at 12:23 a.m. He became the first condemned inmate in California to voluntarily abandon all federal appeals. William George Bonin. William George Bonan was one of the most notorious serial killers in California's criminal history. Nicknamed by the press as the Freeway Killer, Bonan was responsible for a series of crimes committed between 1979 and 1980, in which young males were kidnapped, abused, and murdered. He carried out these acts with the help of several accomplices, all of whom were young men. He was ultimately convicted of 14 confirmed homicides and received 2 death sentences, first in Los Angeles County in 1982 and then in Orange County in 1983. The victims ranged in age from 12 to 19. The crimes followed a disturbingly methodical pattern. Bonan would select his victims, often hitchhikers or youths walking alone, and after gaining their trust, he would lure them into his vehicle and drive them to isolated locations where they were subjected to physical violence and ultimately killed. One of the first known cases occurred in August 1979, when a 17-year-old boy was found dead on the side of a road in Malibu. Authorities noted that the body showed multiple injuries and signs of mistreatment, details that would become common in subsequent crime scenes. In the following months, several other teenage boys were found under similar circumstances throughout Los Angeles County, all clearly linked by a consistent modus operandi. Among the victims was a 12-year-old boy whom Bonan approached after he mentioned he was on his way to Disneyland. This case caused widespread public outrage due to the young age of the victim and the level of brutality involved. In Orange County, authorities discovered the bodies of 4 more young victims, all found near highway exits. These were teenagers who had been hitchhiking when they were intercepted by Bonan and his accomplices. Autopsy reports indicated asphyxiation as the primary cause of death, and in some cases, physical markings suggested the victims had been forcibly restrained prior to being killed. Throughout the investigation, several of Bonan's accomplices were arrested and prosecuted. One of them provided key details that allowed police to identify Bonan's vehicle and place him under surveillance. On June 11, 1980, officers caught him in the act, with a minor inside his van under suspicious circumstances. Inside the vehicle, they found ropes and knives, items consistent with previous crime scenes. After an extensive trial process and multiple appeals, Bonin was finally executed on February 23, 1996 at San Quentin State Prison. He became the first inmate in California to be executed by lethal injection. He spent his last day receiving visits and consuming a final meal that included pizza, ice cream, and soft drinks. Shortly before his execution at 11:30 p.m., he gave his final statement to Warden Calderon. "I believe that the death penalty is not a solution to the current problems. I believe it sends the wrong message to the youth of the country. Young people act as they see others act, rather than as they are told to act. And I would suggest that when someone is considering committing a serious crime, before they do, they go somewhere quiet and think about it seriously." Keith Daniel Williams. Keith Daniel Williams was sentenced to death for the brutal murder of 3 people in Merced, California. His victims were Miguel Vargas, his brother Salvador, and Lourdes Meza. It all began when Williams visited the home of his accomplice, Robert Leslie Tyson. The victims were also present. Williams showed interest in Miguel's car and offered to buy it for $1,500 using a personal check. They agreed that the transaction would be completed once the check cleared at the bank, but Williams never intended to pay. According to the testimony of Karen Tyson, the accomplice's wife, after the victims left, Williams stated that he needed to kill them in order to keep the car. The next day, he insisted he would go through with it and persuaded Tyson to accompany him. On the night of October 8th, they went to the Vargas residence. Leon Macias, the victim's uncle, was present and recalled that everyone sat down to talk about the car. When he came back at 9 a.m., no one answered the door. Later, after learning that Miguel hadn't shown up for work, he returned to the house. There, he discovered his 2 nephews, each executed with a gunshot to the back of the head. Lourdes was missing. 5 days later, the body of Lourdes Meza was found in a nearby field. His execution was carried out on May 3, 1996, at San Quentin State Prison. He was the second inmate in California to be executed by lethal injection. He spent his final day with his attorneys and spiritual advisor. His last meal consisted of fried pork chops, baked potato, asparagus, salad, apple pie, and whole milk. He made no final statement. He was pronounced dead at 12:08 a.m. Thomas Martin Thompson. Thomas Martin Thompson was sentenced to death for the murder of Ginger Lorraine Fleischle, a crime that shocked Orange County, California, in September 1981. Ginger, a 20-year-old college student, had gone out to dinner with her roommate, Tracy Leach, Tracy's ex-husband, David Leach, and Thomas Thompson. Later that night, Ginger and Thompson were seen at a bar with another young man, Afshin Kashani, where they stayed until around 1 a.m. They then went to the apartment shared by Thompson and David Leach. While Ginger briefly stepped out to buy a soda, Thompson allegedly told Kashani that he wanted to have sex with her. According to the investigation, Thompson sexually assaulted her, and when Ginger threatened to report him, he murdered her later that night. Her body was discovered 3 days later in a field in Irvine, wrapped in a sleeping bag and blanket. Forensic evidence found blood and semen traces from Thompson in the apartment, along with fibers and fingerprints tied to his accomplice. Investigators also discovered that David Leach had a motive to eliminate Ginger, as she was interfering with his attempts to reconcile with his ex-wife. After the murder, both men fled to Mexico. Leach was arrested in the U.S., while Thompson was located by Mexican authorities and extradited. In August 1984, Thompson was sentenced to death. On July 14, 1998, Thomas Thompson was executed by lethal injection at San Quentin State Prison. His last meal included crab, ribs, fried rice, and Coca-Cola. He was pronounced dead at 12:06 a.m. Before dying, he delivered the following final statement. For 17 years, the prosecutor has pursued the wrong man. In time, you'll know that. I don't want anyone to avenge my death. Instead, I want people to stop killing. God bless you all. Jaturun Siripongs. On December 15, 1981, 2 people were brutally murdered inside a small business in Garden Grove, California. The victims were Pakaven Watanaporn, the store owner, and her employee, Kwach Nguyen. The scene was bloody and chaotic. Watanaporn had been strangled. Nguyen, on the other hand, had suffered multiple stab wounds to the head and neck, as well as defensive wounds and a rope tied around his arm. Both bodies were found in the storage room of Pantai Market, the shop they worked in. 1 day later, police found blood-stained clothing and a rope matching the one used in the crime inside a nearby dumpster. Soon, all the evidence pointed to one name, Jaturun Siripongs, a Thai immigrant who had occasionally worked at the store. He was arrested on December 17th while attempting to make purchases with credit cards belonging to the victims. At the time of his arrest, he had visible cuts on his fingers. Forensic evidence revealed that the blood found at the crime scene, as well as on the discarded clothing and a bloodied rope, matched his blood type. A search of his car uncovered dried blood, the victim's jewelry, and receipts for purchases dated after the murders. At his home, police found a set of knives similar to the murder weapon. Seripongs admitted to taking part in the robbery but denied responsibility for the killings. He claimed that an accomplice, whose name he refused to disclose, committed the murders. The defense suggested that this person was his girlfriend's younger sister, a 17-year-old who testified against him but had returned to Thailand before the trial. However, a later federal review found no evidence to support that claim. On April 22, 1983, an Orange County jury sentenced him to death for 2 counts of first-degree murder, robbery, and burglary. His execution was initially scheduled for November 1998, but was temporarily blocked by a federal judge. It was eventually rescheduled for February 9, 1999. The case sparked significant public debate. On February 9, 1999, Jatarun Seripongs was executed by lethal injection at San Quentin State Prison. He made no final statement. His last meal consisted of 2 cans of iced tea and 2 servings of canned peaches. He was pronounced dead at 12:19 a.m. That night, outside the prison, anti-death penalty protesters clashed with supporters of the execution. Manuel Babbot. On the night of December 18, 1980, in South Sacramento, California, 78-year-old Leah Schendel was the victim of a brutal attack. During the early morning hours, a man broke into her apartment. He beat her violently, sexually assaulted her, and ransacked her home. The following morning, Mrs. Schendel's partially naked body was found on the floor of her bedroom, partially covered by a blood-stained mattress. The scene was deeply disturbing. The autopsy revealed that she had died from cardiac arrest, brought on by the extreme stress of the assault and physical trauma. But the violence didn't end there. Just hours later, on the night of December 19th, the same attacker attempted to rape another woman in Sacramento. He was arrested shortly afterward. The suspect was Manuel Babbot, a Vietnam War veteran. Although he did not deny the incidents, he claimed to have no memory of what had happened. Despite his claim, several items belonging to Mrs. Schendel were found in his possession, directly linking him to the homicide. In 1982, a Sacramento County jury found Babbitt guilty of first-degree murder with special circumstances. He was sentenced to death on July 6th of that same year. Over the following years, Babbitt remained on death row at San Quentin State Prison. In 1998, while awaiting execution, he was awarded the Purple Heart for injuries sustained nearly 3 decades earlier during the Vietnam War. The award reignited public debate over his sentence, but the court's decision stood. On May 4, 1999, at 12:29 a.m., the execution of Manuel Babbot by lethal injection began. He was pronounced dead at 12:37 a.m. He declined a last meal and chose to fast until the moment of his death. He spent his final hours in the company of family, friends, and his attorneys. His final words were, "I forgive all of you." Darrell Keith Rich. Darrell Keith Rich was found guilty of 4 counts of first-degree murder for the deaths of 4 young women between July and August 1978. 3 of these convictions were aggravated by special circumstances. On January 23, 1981, a Yolo County jury sentenced him to death. The first victim, 19-year-old Annette Faye Edwards, was attacked and suffered multiple fatal head injuries. The second, 17-year-old Patricia Ann Moore, was taken to a remote location, assaulted, and beaten to death. Linda Diane Slavic, 26 years old, was driven from Chico to Rich's home in Cottonwood. There, she was assaulted and later taken to a remote area where she was shot to death. Before her murder, she was shown the body of Patricia Ann Moore, killed at the same location. The fourth victim, 11-year-old Annette Lynn Seelix, was brought to Rich's home, where she endured severe abuse. She was then thrown off a bridge more than 30 meters high, resulting in her death. 3 days before his arrest, Rich confessed to a friend that he had found a corpse. The friend reported this to the police, who began an investigation. Rich failed a polygraph test, raising further suspicion. He then admitted to receiving money for the murder of one woman and gave conflicting statements about his involvement in another case. He was arrested and confessed to the crimes, handing over the murder weapon and key details to the police. In addition to the murders, Rich was found guilty of other serious offenses, including assaults and kidnappings. On March 15, 2000, Darrell Keith Rich was executed by lethal injection at San Quentin State Prison. He was pronounced dead at 12:13 a.m. He declined a last meal and spent his final hours with attorneys and spiritual advisors. His last words were simply, "Peace." Robert Lee Massie. Robert Lee Massie was sentenced to death for the murder of Boris G. Naumoff, which occurred on January 3, 1979, during a robbery at a liquor store in San Francisco. During the same incident, another employee, Charles Harris, was injured. The San Francisco County jury handed down the death sentence on May 25, 1979. At the time, Massie was on parole for a 1965 murder in Los Angeles County. Although he had initially been sentenced to death for that crime, the sentence was overturned in 1972 following a California Supreme Court ruling that declared the death penalty unconstitutional. According to a witness, on the afternoon of January 3, 1979, Massie was at the liquor store counter face-to-face with Naumoff. The witness, believing Massie to be a customer, approached to greet him. Naumoff handed money to Massie, who placed it in his jacket pocket. Minutes later, as Naumoff headed to the back room, a struggle began with Massie. During the fight, Massie fired several shots, fatally wounding Naumoff in the neck and injuring Harris in the right thigh. Although Massie fled the scene, the witness managed to hide and call the police. Ultimately, on March 27, 2001, Robert Lee Massie was executed by lethal injection at San Quentin State Prison. He was pronounced dead at 12:33 a.m. His last meal consisted of 2 vanilla milkshakes, extra crispy French fries, fried oysters, and soft drinks. He spent his final hours with spiritual advisors and attorneys. His last words were, "Forgiveness," giving up all hope for a better past. Stephen Wayne Anderson. Stephen Wayne Anderson was sentenced to death for the murder of Elizabeth Lyman, which occurred on May 26, 1980 in San Bernardino County, California. Elizabeth Lyman, an 81-year-old retired piano teacher, lived alone in her home in Bloomington. Shortly after midnight, Anderson, a 26-year-old man who had escaped from Utah State Prison months earlier, broke into Lyman's house. He cut the phone line with a knife, confident no one was home. However, he was caught off guard when the victim woke up in her bed. Anderson shot her at point-blank range in the face with a .45 caliber revolver while she lay in bed. After the murder, Anderson covered the body with a blanket and retrieved the spent cartridge casing. He then ransacked the house searching for money, finding less than $100. Finally, he sat down to eat in Lyman's kitchen, but his meal was interrupted when sheriff's deputies, alerted by a neighbor who had noticed suspicious activity, arrived and arrested him at 3:47 a.m. At the time, Anderson was a fugitive after escaping from a Utah prison in November 1979, where he was serving time for several counts of aggravated robbery. While incarcerated, Anderson had committed other violent acts, including the murder of an inmate and assaults on other prisoners and a guard. On July 24, 1981, a San Bernardino County jury sentenced him to death for first-degree murder with special circumstances and residential robbery. On January 29, 2002, at 12:18 a.m., Anderson was executed by lethal injection at San Quentin State Prison. He was pronounced dead at 12:30 a.m. His last meal consisted of 2 grilled cheese sandwiches, a glass of cottage cheese, a mix of corn and hominy, a serving of peach pie, chocolate chip ice cream, and radishes. When the prison warden asked if he had any final words, Anderson refused to respond. Donald J. Beardsley. In 1969 in Missouri, Beardsley strangled, stabbed, and drowned Laura Griffin, a woman he had just met at a bar. After drinking and dancing with her, they went together to her home. Beardsley voluntarily surrendered and confessed to the murder. He was convicted of second-degree murder, sentenced to 19 years, and served 7 before being released on parole in 1977. No clear motive for the crime was ever established. 4 years later, while on parole, Beardsley was arrested in California for the murder of 2 women connected to a drug-related dispute that occurred on April 5, 1981, in Redwood City. Prosecutors explained that an outstanding drug debt among friends had triggered the events. According to the accusation, Beardsley and another person shot one of the victims, while Beardsley allegedly slit the throat of the other. Beardsley's phone was found near one of the bodies, and after police contacted him, he confessed and led authorities to the second body. Because he was on parole, he was deemed eligible for the death penalty due to recidivism. He was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. The defense attempted to appeal, alleging inadequate legal representation and mental health issues stemming from a head injury Beardsley had suffered years earlier. However, prosecutors argued that his intelligence was above average, although family members indicated he had difficulties expressing emotions, and prison records noted diagnoses of schizophrenia. Ultimately, on January 19, 2005, Beardsley was executed by lethal injection in California, marking the first execution in the state since Arnold Schwarzenegger took office as governor. Beardsley made no final statement. The governor denied clemency, stating that the defendant was not so impaired by his disability as to be unable to distinguish right from wrong. Stanley Williams. Stanley Williams was one of the co-founders of the Crips, one of the most violent and well-known street gangs in the United States. In 1981, he was sentenced to death for a series of murders committed in 1979 during 2 separate robberies. On February 28th of that year, around 4 a.m., Williams and 3 companions were traveling by car when they ran out of gas. They decided to rob a store to get money. They stopped at a 7-Eleven in Whittier. The employee, 26-year-old Albert Lewis Owens, was sweeping the parking lot. He was forced inside the store. while Williams' accomplices emptied the cash register and stole $120. Williams took Owens to a back room, ordered him to kneel, and shot him in the back with a shotgun. Days later, on March 11, 1979, at 5:30 a.m., Williams entered the Brookhaven Motel on South Vermont Avenue in Los Angeles. Inside were Sai-Shay Young, 67, his wife, Yenny Yang, 63, and their daughter, Ye Chen Lin, 43. All three were murdered. Williams stole about $50 before fleeing the scene. He was arrested, tried, and sentenced to death in 1981. Throughout the trial, Williams never admitted to the crimes. While in prison, he claimed to have undergone a profound personal transformation. He renounced violence, wrote books aimed at young people with anti-gang messages, and became a public figure within the anti-gang movement. He was even nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize for his educational efforts from death row.
Working together, we can put an end to this cycle that creates deep pain in the hearts of our mothers, our fathers, and our people who have lost loved ones to this senseless violence.
His execution took place at San Quentin State Prison on December 13, 2005. The procedure was delayed 20 minutes due to difficulties inserting one of the needles. Williams was pronounced dead at 12:35 a.m. He made no final statement and did not request a special last meal. He only drank milk in the hours leading up to his death. Clarence Ray Allen. In 1974, Clarence Ray Allen orchestrated the robbery of a small, family-owned grocery store in Fresno, California, known as Fran's Market. He recruited 2 employees from his security company, as well as a young woman named Mary Sue Kitts, to gain access to the store's keys. Kitts obtained the information through Brian Schletwitz, the son of the store owner. After the robbery, Allen successfully cashed the stolen money orders, but when Kitts confessed to Schletwitz who was behind the crime, Allen decided she had to be silenced. Shortly thereafter, the young woman was murdered. Allen was arrested, found guilty of murder, and sentenced to life in prison on March 16, 1978. He was sent to Folsom State Prison, where he met fellow inmate Billy Ray Hamilton. The two formed a close relationship. While incarcerated, Allen devised a plan to eliminate those he blamed for his conviction, among them Brian Schletwitz. On September 4, 1980, just 3 days after being paroled, Hamilton met with Allen's son, who provided him with weapons. That same night, accompanied by his partner Connie Barbeau, Hamilton returned to Fran's Market. Though the store was already closed, they managed to get inside. Once in, Hamilton held the employees at gunpoint and forced them to sit down. He then led Brian Schletwitz to the safe. When Schletwitz tried to cooperate, Hamilton shot him at point-blank range. He then returned to the back of the store and executed Douglas White and Josephine Rocha. He also attempted to kill Joe Rios, who survived but sustained serious injuries to his arm. After ensuring the victims could not identify them, Hamilton and Barbeau fled the scene. Days later, Hamilton was arrested for an unrelated crime. Among his possessions, police found a notebook containing notes that directly linked Allen to the Fran's Market murders. The evidence was sufficient to charge Allen again. He was found guilty of 3 counts of first-degree murder with special circumstances and was transferred to death row at San Quentin on December 2, 1982. Clarence Ray Allen was executed by lethal injection on January 17, 2006. He was 76 years old and legally blind. The execution began at 12:20 a.m., and he was pronounced dead at 12:38 a.m. He was the second oldest inmate to be executed in the United States since the reinstatement of the death penalty in 1976. His final meal included buffalo steak, fried chicken, fry bread, sugar-free pecan pie, sugar-free black walnut ice cream, and whole milk. Before his death, Clarence Ray Allen gave the following final statement. First of all, I want to say how grateful I am for that wonderful last meal, how much I enjoyed it, and how deeply I love my family and friends who have stood by me all these years. I also want to thank my friends in Europe who have written to me, my spiritual advisor Richard Williams, a Dutch woman, Henny Rip, and another from Italy, Christine Kaufman, to whom I gave the Indian name Morning Sun, and who has been just that for me, and to all the death row inmates I leave behind, who will one day follow me. A very good friend I hate to leave behind, who has been my neighbor for 20 years, is Ward Weaver. To all my family who came to visit me during this time, I love you so much for being with me. My final words will be, Hoka, hey, it's a good day to die. Thank you all very much. I love you all. Goodbye. After Clarence's execution, the death penalty was suspended in California due to a combination of factors: growing ethical and racial concerns, fears of wrongful convictions, the high financial cost of the process, and legal issues surrounding the lethal injection method. The moratorium declared by the governor in 2019 formalized a suspension that had, in practice, been in effect since 2006.